Welcome, and thank you for joining us on Archives Live. I'm your host tonight, Libby Whitlow. Joining us in the Architecture Building is David Peters, head of the OSU Archives. On tonight's show, David and I are going to talk through some of the spaces that have changed on campus throughout the years and discuss the people that were instrumental in making those changes. We will explore hidden spots you might not know about, and then some of the most beloved spaces you have visited while you were at OSU. If you would like to share your favorite corner of campus with us, let us know in the comments, and we can talk about how it has or hasn't changed over the years. With that, let's get started.
All right.
So, to give people an idea, what are the dimensions of university property? What are we working with here?
So that's a hard question to answer because we started with roughly 200 acres, it was about a half mile by a half mile, a little bit longer on one end. Now we're over 600 to 800 acres for just the campus. University property extends out west of town. We have thousands of acres for the university. So the dimensions of campus have about tripled in size from the original campus, but that's where we are now. So.
Very nice. And where did campus start? Where did it start? What was there during the early years of OAMC?
So the initial borders of campus on the south was College Avenue, now we know it as University Avenue. On the east, it was Knobloch. On the west, it was Stout Lane. So if you know where Stout Hall, there's a lane just to the west of that then goes north. And then on the north side, it was Hall of Fame, what we call Hall of Fame now. So those were kind of the boundaries of that original acreage. All right. Initially, there was nothing there. It had been the traditional lands. It was kind of a border area between the Osage, who were in the north, and the Kiowa, who were in the south. With the reassignment of lands in Oklahoma and the bringing of additional Native American tribes, a lot of boundaries then changed. But initially, this was the borderlands between Osage and Kiowa, and it was prairie. The area was settled in 1889 with the first land run. And so that's when settlement occurs, and that's how we end up where we are. Stillwater decided it wanted the college here, and they were lucky in getting it, and then individuals provided that property. But there was, I think, only maybe about 10 acres that had been plowed by the time we received it, roughly a year and a half after they had homesteaded. And so it's flat prairie. Initially, 4 wood frame buildings are built. The first building on campus is a barn, which is located roughly where Hester Avenue intersects with Morrill Avenue. So Morrill Avenue, as it's getting ready to close to the Student Union, there was a barn right at that intersection there. And Morrill Avenue was the way to get back and forth to the barn from Knobloch. There was a chemistry lab that was located near Old Central. Then there was also a botany lab near Old Central. And then just north of what we know the Saratine Center now, there was a house that was originally constructed for the president. The president didn't want to live there, though, because he had a homestead, and he was afraid if he lived in Stillwater, he might lose his homestead. So the experiment station director and his family lived in that little wood frame house. So those 4 structures are constructed before Old Central is completed, 1894. How much more detail do you want?
Well, I know Old Central is a great touchstone for students and alums for plenty of generations. But which buildings are still surviving from the territorial era?
So from the territorial era, which ends in 1907, all we have is Old Central, completed in 1894, and then Morrill Hall, which was completed in 1906. So those are the only 2 that remain from that first territorial period.
Yeah. And when did the university kind of begin to see a change in the locations of its facilities? Or when did it see an initial burst of growth?
So until statehood, we're really a community college serving mostly Stillwater students. With statehood, we begin to attract additional students from around the state, and we begin developing more classroom space, more research areas, and then residence halls. We'd never had residence halls until 1909, 1910, because now we have these students coming in from other locations. And so that's when the university really begins to expand from just the Stillwater Community College to just kind of a small regional college. We still don't have more than probably 2,500 students well into the 1920s. But it's a small place. The center of campus is really around Old Central in that early period, and most of that other 200 acres is devoted to the Agricultural Experiment Station farm. So.
Very nice. And are there any buildings built on top of old ones, or even facilities built around the exterior of old ones?
There are plenty of buildings. And so many of the early buildings we lost due to issues regarding construction and the clay soils. They just hadn't allocated or made arrangements for the expansion and contraction of clay soils in Oklahoma. And so many of those early foundations just were unable to hold those buildings for long periods of time. And so we've lost a number of buildings. Some of those we repurposed the stone and the brick in other buildings, but yeah, many of the earliest buildings were also torn down. Where the Alumni Center is now, there used to be an engineering building, there used to be a library. Where the eastern side of Student Union, there used to be a chemistry building. The Saratine Center is built around what was the old auditorium. There had been an auditorium built in 1910, 1911, and the Saratine Center was built around that. I'm not sure how many of these you want, but there are a number of buildings have replaced at those same sites earlier facilities. The previous business administration building was built on top of what used to be the civil engineering building. These things have changed dramatically through the years, and the campus continues to grow and develop. Recently, the New Spears School of Business was built where Hanner Hall used to be, and so Hanner was a twin, kind of a mirror image of Thatcher Hall, which still exists. In the most recent years, we've begun replacing some of those older facilities, and there's some other facilities that probably won't be with us much longer.
And let's talk a little bit about where we are tonight. I mentioned at the beginning that we are in the architecture building, but if you kind of want to walk the audience through what we're looking at, especially on your side.
So on my side, behind me, is the original architecture building. Originally, it was the gymnasium, a gymnasium and armory, and it was completed right at the end of World War I. So it served as a gymnasium for its longest period of time. When they built this building is when our football field, which used to go north and south, just east of here, they had to move to going east and west where Boone Pickens Stadium is now. But that field, when it was moved, then still retained the name Lewis Field for a number of years until recently it was renamed for Mr. Pickens. So this building was initially built for gymnasium and armory, but then within the last 10, 15 years, architecture had been inhabiting the building for a while, and then they built these two wings on it, and now the School of Architecture is located here. And what's a little kind of interesting to me is when they initially built the facility, they had envisioned two wings on the east and west sides, and sure enough, 90 years later, they were built. If you come to this building, you can see there's kind of a distinct break between the older facility and the new facility. But what I really like about how they've integrated the old facility is as they've repurposed it, you can still see vestiges of where other things were. There was a swimming pool. So it's really a kind of a fascinating blending of the old and new here in the architecture building.
Yeah, and we've got some images tonight of the old gymnasium and what the old building looked like, if you want to walk us through those.
So that was the gymnasium where Gallagher started wrestling and Iba started playing basketball with their teams, and that was on the second level. So that was the level above where we are now, and then there was a track that ran all the way around the outside of that, and so people could run even when the weather was bad. But yeah, that's the old gymnasium, and that area has now all been completely repurposed for architecture.
When I look at this, I'm like, we are spoiled with the Colvin. The current students are completely spoiled.
And there's the building after it was completed. This is in the 1920s, maybe early 30s. So the main entrance was on the south face, and those doors then took you up to the second floor. The first floor was where the locker rooms were located. It's where the swimming pool was located on the one side. So the first floor is mostly locker room space and office space for athletic personnel. And then the armory, of course, was part of that, and that's where they stored the rifles and other ammunitions. So.
In this part, so when you look at it today back here, this is all Boone Pickens.
Yes, behind us, actually, beyond, I don't know if you can see the cursor, but on this corner back here, behind that corner is where Boone Pickens Stadium is located. And behind it on the other side is where the Lewis Field used to be before they moved it going east and west.
And I remember my family will tailgate over and face this building. And so when I would look at it when I was little, when I didn't really know about a lot of stylistic choices, when it says gymnasium, the U looks like the V, and I thought, well, they spelled it wrong. What are they doing? Can you talk a little bit about the stylistic choices in the building?
So this building was designed by one of our graduates and a faculty member from the School of Architecture at the time. I think it was the Department of Architecture at the time. Fritz Reglich was the architecture faculty member, but then Phil Wilbur, who was a recent graduate, was involved with the design and the construction of this building. This is, I call it the pre-Bennett period. Many of our buildings before President Bennett arrived are much more eclectic. They have a variety of different styles to them. And so like Old Central, Morrill Hall, Bartlett Center, those are all pre-Bennett buildings. When Bennett comes in, he brings in his modified Georgian style that Wilbur he worked together on that. So this is a pre-Bennett building, and I'm not sure of the style. We need to ask one of the architects here if they could help us out. But one of the issues with the building is they were having trouble getting steel for it during World War I. And so that's when they added the armory part of it. So it became the gymnasium and armory. And once it was an armory, then we got steel from the federal government to complete the building because the armory was needed for military training.
Nice.
I should have said it sooner, but I remember those older buildings too have columns. And so like Morrill Hall has columns, Bartlett used to have columns kind of in the front on one side. We'll see some other buildings that have columns, but if they have columns like that, they're most likely a pre-Bennett building. There's a few exceptions.
And this is a picture currently of the display in the architecture building that tells the story of the history of the architecture department on campus as well as the gymnasium. So that's a new fun design if anyone gets a chance to come look at that. And I think that's all we have for pictures right now, but don't worry, we'll come back because we have a lot to go through tonight. But there are a lot of older buildings on campus that have kind of some hidden gems in them. Do you have any favorite kind of hidden gems within the buildings?
I'll give you a couple. So what we know is the Paul Miller Journalism Broadcasting Building now. There's an addition that was put on the east side of that building. Originally, it was the old science or chemistry building, and we may have a picture of it.
Let's see.
We'll see if it comes up here. Maybe not.
It's here somewhere.
That's okay. So when they added the addition on, oh, there it is. So if you notice, those columns are facing east. And so those are the columns that were a part of the science or chemistry building. Well, that new facade covers that up completely. But you can access the room. It's kind of a janitor's closet now or a storage area. But those columns are still there. And so I think it's fascinating that they saved the columns, just nobody can see them. The old auditorium, where the Saratine Center, the main auditorium is now if you go in there, it's an angled floor, from high up in the back, then angled down to the stage area. Initially, that was a flat floor with a U-shaped, kind of a horseshoe-shaped balcony around it. Well, when they put in that angled floor, there's actually spaces under that floor. Some of it's office spaces, but others kind of more, once again, kind of storage spaces. They used to be on the main floor of the building, but now are kind of tucked in behind other things. We have a room in the library that very few people know about. It's the Angie DeBow room. It's where President Bennett had designed a place kind of away from the activity in Whitehurst, and where he could go and visit with potential donors, visit with political contacts he had, alumni. And so he wanted it away from everyone else. And that room is still back there, and it's a lovely room. Just very few people know about it and have access to it. Hopefully in the future we can provide better routes to it and get it more exposed, because it really is a lovely room.
Nice. If you're just now joining us, I'm here with David Peters talking about the changing facilities on campus. If you have questions or comments, go ahead and type them in the comments section and we'll get to them on the live stream tonight. So, what is the center of campus now, and where has it been before?
So the pre-Bennett period, the center of campus is Old Central. It really got its name by being the center of campus, and that original little quadrangle around it that includes Morrill Hall and Bartlett, that original auditorium where Saratine is, Gunderson, which still exists. It was an engineering building, but they all kind of encircle Old Central. Now, if you notice, there's nothing to the south of Old Central, so you could see Old Central from College Avenue. There used to be a circular drive that went from Knobloch up through where the fire station is now, around Old Central and back. But they wanted to keep that vision of Old Central available for the public traveling along College. With Bennett, his plan was to dramatically expand both the size and capabilities of the campus, and so he envisions a new center of campus located where the library is now. And so he comes out with a plan, he calls it the 25-year plan, and it's released in 1929, right before the stock market crash. So there's no funding for this. It takes years for this to develop. And the last building where he was there for the groundbreaking, for the groundbreaking ceremony, was the library. But he passed away before the library was completed. But that is what he saw as both the physical center and the academic center of campus. And today I still think it's the academic center of campus. But geographically we've continued to spread to the north and to the west, northwest. And so as that's happened, our geographical center continues to move to the north and west. But I think for the main campus area, for most of the academic facilities and research facilities, I think the library still serves as the center. At least I like to think it does.
Agreed. We have a picture of Henry Bennett tonight because we talk about him so much on the show, and part of the show tonight is talking about those people that were very influential in the campus change. So you mentioned the 25-year plan. Can you also elaborate on the styles that mark those Bennett years and how you can differentiate when buildings were pre-Bennett, post-Bennett? What was unique to him?
So the Bennett plan, many of those buildings are going to be centered somehow on the library. They're going to face into the library. They're going to be geometrically aligned to the library. There's a certain blend of brick. It's called the OSU blend of brick. And so many of our buildings look very similar with that brick pattern. Those are probably a Bennett plan building, at least initially. So if you go to Morrill Hall or Old Central, that brick is different. Bartlett Center, the brick is different. This building, the brick is different. And so those are pre-Bennett. The Bennett ones, it's a modified, and this is kind of under discussion still, but it's a modified Georgian architecture. The angle of the roof, the dormers on the roof, the colors they use, the roofs were generally the green slate. And so Wilbur, he worked very closely with Phil Wilbur to kind of develop this standard plan and style for all buildings, at least during the Bennett period. Even some buildings that were pre-Bennett, Whitehurst Hall was only 3 floors high. Bennett decides to add that 4th floor and design an angled roof just like Willard across the parking lot from it. So it acts as a Bennett building, but it was really a pre-Bennett building. So anyway, but then that changed over time after President Bennett's passing, and then Oliver Willem was president, kind of continued the plan, but things became a little more modern. The window styles became a little more modern. Some of the roofing elements and the decorative elements started to change. They just modernized everything. But they still are using the Oklahoma State blend for brick. The recent changes at the Boone Pickens Stadium when they built it, they're using the OSU blend, and so that blend is still the brick that's preferred, but some of the other features have changed.
Yeah, we've got Henry Bennett here. We got an image of him, and then we also have an image pointing to his campus development plan. And in addition, we have a scanned map as a plan for the development of campus. And I think it's interesting how when you look at the library on here, it looks a little different than what we see today. So can you talk about a little bit of the changes of streets throughout OSU history?
So initially, there was just the street to the south, College, and the street to the east, Knobloch, and then the few streets going in. Hester went into campus, and Morrill Avenue went into campus. By the time Bennett's here, Washington Street has really become kind of an east-west boundary. So on the east is really the campus, on the west is agricultural. So the Agricultural Experiment Station is still actively involved west of Washington Street. But President Bennett's, with this new move of the campus north and west, with the library as the center, he saw Washington Street, which was a county section road, as being a main thoroughfare to bring people through campus. And so coming up State Highway 177, they were going to funnel them through campus. Well, when he proposes this, 1939, 1930, there's only about 2,500 students on campus. By the time the library is ready for construction in the early 1950s, We've had the GI Bill. Now we've got 16, 17,000 students on campus. It would just have been a logistical nightmare to have that many students traveling back and forth, plus all of this traffic coming up a state highway. So initially, the library was planned to be right in the center, and if those people have been to Oklahoma City and the state capital for Oklahoma, but Lincoln Avenue goes around the Capitol as you get to the Capitol. That's what Bennett had envisioned for the library, that people would drive through and go around the library as they were passing through campus. Well, that all changed. They decided eventually to close Washington Street. They moved the library where it is now. So it's still at the center, it's just moved to the north between Engineering South and what was called the Biology Building, now it's Life Sciences East. So on this plan, the darkest colored buildings were buildings that were already there when he started the plan. And what he's done, and Phil Wilbur assisted with this, but they've created these patterns. And so Hanner Hall is here, and it gets additions. The lighter colored material are additions, and they put the same additions on to Thatcher Hall. If you can see here, he's got the wings adding on to the architecture building. It was the gymnasium, but the architecture building. And so what they're doing is everything is trying to balance out with each other. Biology, now life sciences, engineering. I think this was going to be another engineering building. This may have been agronomy, but they're all in a pattern around the library, and the library serves as the center. So.
Very nice. Yeah, it was interesting the other day when we were talking about how that traffic flow would have just, with the increase of students on campus, it would not have been feasible. Yeah. So next time you're in Stillwater and there's traffic, just think it could have been a lot worse. Could have been a lot worse.
The thing that's also interesting about Bennett is, he had a plan, but then he was able to adapt and be flexible. I mean, he knew, things change over time. As the demographic changed, the plan changed. And so student housing changed, the research facilities, classrooms, that all, were integrated into what actually developed that he wouldn't have been prepared for or knew about, but he knew you just had to be flexible.
Yeah, and let's dive a little bit more into those residential buildings on campus. How have these res buildings seen change? Where were the hot spots before versus now?
Also, the Bartlett Center for the Studio Arts started off as the residence hall for women, and the home of it was called Domestic Science at the time. Now we call it Human Sciences, but that was the home for that school and for women. And that was with the dining. The only dining facilities on campus were located on the west side of that building on the first floor. The first boys' dormitory is long gone. Hanner and Thatcher Hall were the next to be completed. Thatcher has been the home for the military sciences, ROTC, for a number of years. I'm not sure how many years, but a long time. But it started off as a women's dormitory, and then the men's dormitory, Hanner, just was across from it now, is gone. I'm trying to think. Willard Hall, of course, was a women's residence hall, and now it's where the part of education for the College of Education and Human Sciences. I'm not sure. I'm sure what the title is anymore, but when they merged, education is still in Willard. What used to be known as Murray Hall has now been changed, thankfully, to the School of Social Sciences and Humanities. But that building was a residence hall, and in the north wing to that was a residence hall, and Stout Hall was a residence hall. It still is. The Honors College students, I believe, live in Stout. I think those are the main ones that have switched over. Bennett Hall is still around. Some of the high-rise dormitories, Wilhelm North and South, which were 12 and 14 stories high, built in the 60s, are long gone. The last pair like that are the Kurt Drummond complex, and they're not going to be around much longer. And then there's still, of course, the Wilhelm Scott Parker Wentz, and most of those parts of them have been converted to other things for offices. And then like Cordell Hall, which was a residence hall for men for a long time, is now that eastern parking lot, or that western parking lot west of Boone Pickens Stadium, but there was a men's residence hall there for a number of years.
We've got some pictures of these residence halls, a couple that we mentioned. So here we're looking at, that's
the Bartlett Center.
Bartlett Center now.
It was the first women's building and domestic science building. Mm-hmm.
And across the street from this is the Spoon, which is in front of the Saratine Center.
Right. The Spoon was just across the street from that. As you see my cursor there, there was there was a center window on the 3rd floor, and that's where the residence hall matron lived. And she could keep an eye on any activities that were occurring in the Spoon, which was a bench where young men and women could meet and visit. But she had a bird's eye view of what was going on in the Spoon across the hall, or across the street where the Saracen Center is now, and the Spoon is still there.
Yeah, it's really easy to pass, but if you're walking in front of the Saracen Center, keep your eyes peeled, because that is one of those hidden spaces on campus that used to be apparently a pretty good date spot. And next we have, there's Henry again.
That was Cordell Hall, and so that's where that parking lot is west of Boone Pickens Stadium. And so that had been a men's residence hall for a long period of time. Parts of it then served other functions. For a while, the audiovisual department was in a section of it. Some graduate students were in part of it for College of Engineering. So they would adapt these buildings if they were no longer used as residence hall. And now it's, of course, it's no longer with us.
I was shocked to see how big it was. I don't know why, that just blew my mind. I was like, and it's not even here anymore.
Yep.
That's so crazy. Well, how have some of these buildings been modified to fit the current needs of campus?
So we talked about 2 examples, the chemistry / science building being modified and converted with the addition to the Paul Miller Journalism Broadcasting building, the old auditorium being integrated into the Saracen Center, and so that was a fairly major change that occurred. I'm trying to think of some others. Of course, the student union keeps growing and expanding, so it started off a much smaller facility than it is now, but it keeps expanding. I talked about Whitehurst Hall having the 4th floor added, so it would blend in with the other Bennett structures. Gallagher-Iba. So when that was first completed in the late 30s, 38, 39, it was designated as a 4-H building, as a place where 4-H students from around the state could gather for their annual meetings. But almost immediately, people began referring to it as Gallagher Hall because of Edward Clark Gallagher, who was our wrestling coach, who passed away about just shortly after it was completed. And so that it got the name Gallagher Hall, even though that was the official name. And then with the expansion of it, so this is almost, 15, almost 20 years ago. But anyway, there was a dramatic expansion in the size of what Gallagher Hall was into Gallagher-Iba Arena now. I think they more than doubled roughly the seating capacity and all the other auxiliary things that go on within that facility. So that was a significant, and they didn't lose a single season. I mean, that was all done. They started the work in one season, then the season ended, and they finished everything in time for the next season. So it was a fairly significant. Of course, our Boone Pickens Stadium was much smaller early on when it was known as Lewis Field. We never had an official stadium name, it was just Lewis Field. But then it changed and developed over time, and you can still see some vestiges of those earlier stands if you go underneath. They've kind of hidden most of that, but it's changed dramatically too. So.
And there's a lot of things that changed about campus that we kind of take for granted. Like, I think of like plumbing and electricity. What was the first building on campus that got electricity or was planned to have electricity?
So from what I can tell, it's around statehood when we first began that transition over to electric. It's like Old Central and even all of those earlier buildings. The lighting came from gas lights. They each had their own little boiler unit to heat the building. There was no air conditioning, of course. So I'm thinking it's right around statehood where they first began looking at electricity being installed in buildings, and when they complete a power plant that was done, where the west part of the classroom building is now was a power plant completed about 1911, 1912. When that plant was completed to generate electricity, then that's when they began connecting all of the buildings to electrical power. And so a lot of installation of electrical lines went in at that point. Early on, that's when the tunnels began to be developed across campus, connecting these places. But they had some issues with electricity. There was a Morrill Hall fire that gutted the building in 1914, and the Bartlett Center also had a fire in October of 1914. And they're fairly confident that both of those fires started due to electrical shorts or something relating to the electrical systems that had been installed. But those are some of the early buildings that had electricity in them. After 1910, 1912, most of the new buildings coming online have electricity, and most of them have water by then. Early on, part of the reason Theta Pond was constructed is to raise the water table so they could drill wells around it and then pump water to the east to the rest of campus, because they were just having a terrible time getting water around Old Central and those earlier buildings. So anyway, the first air conditioning, if you're interested, occurred in what used to be the Civil Engineering Building. It's where the kind of Student Success Center is being built now for engineering. But there was a Civil Engineering Building there, and that had the first room where they were learning about air conditioning and how to, I guess, how to build it, how to maintain it. But then the first building completed with air conditioning, the whole building, is the Student Union, which made it very popular. And of course, the library was the second, and the classroom was the third. So those were the first three with air conditioning in them.
Very nice. Well, let's see. And the first building was plumbing. What did they do? When was plumbing introduced to campus, and what did they have to do beforehand?
So before statehood, there were a few pump water stations where you could, pump water, and there were some barrels that they installed in some of the attics or roofs areas on some of the buildings where they would pump water in there and then it was gravity fed down. But there were no bathrooms in the early buildings. There were outhouses at various locations around campus. The women's building, now it's the Bartlett Center for Studio Art, was the first building that I am aware of that where restrooms were planned to be installed, in the building. They didn't have to go outside anymore. So, and the boys' residence hall too had the same. They had their first bathrooms.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. If you've just tuned in, I'm with Head of Archives, David Peters, discussing the changing facilities on campus. Feel free to leave questions or comments in the comment section to keep the conversation going. So we've touched a little bit about Henry Bennett and a couple, and Wilbur, and other people who have influenced the styles on campus, but who were some other figures that come to mind that were instrumental in making unique styles on campus?
I think sometimes we leave out certain individuals who weren't involved with buildings, but they were involved with kind of the style that develops on campus, and those are the people involved with landscape. And so beginning in the 1930s, Henry Bennett hires a graduate from Oklahoma A&M College named Brian Thompson. And Brian Thompson really is the one who developed the formal gardens at the Student Union. He planted a number of trees around campus. He was really the individual to bring in the magnolias on campus. He brought in just a variety of plantings and really did a lot to kind of develop the campus landscaping structure. There have been a number of individuals, I can't think of all their names right offhand, but most recently, of course, Steve Dobbs, who came back and was managing our landscaping here for a number of years. And now, with a later trend now has been the use of like native varieties, and so they don't need as much water. They're able to adapt to the environment better. So they need less maintenance. We've also, there's more little spots on campus where people can meet or linger or just relax. And that's all a part of that outdoor space that people utilize so often. And sometimes we're so busy we just walk past these locations. But really there's wonderful little location spots all over campus where you can just, there's a bench under a shade tree and you can just sit there and relax and contemplate life for a little bit. So those are the places I really enjoy.
Very nice. Yeah, I was going to talk a little bit too about the major gardens that have changed on campus, but do you have any favorite pocket gardens or details in landscaping that you think are unique to OSU?
Well, they're unique spaces because they're here, but most recently there's the Remembrance Garden that's going in just west of the fire station. That entrance, that driveway to the fire station was the original kind of gateway to campus. And so I think it's very meaningful that this Remembrance Garden is going right in at that location. And it's going to be a quiet spot. There's nice trees in the area. They've done some other plantings. But I can see that as being a nice spot in the future. I love that area around Old Central with the larger trees. And so there's many little spots around there where I enjoy sitting if I have a chance. Of course, around Theta Pond is always, at least for the last 60, 70 years, has been a lovely spot for people to gather and for you just to sit on a bench there and enjoy your time. There's little gardens, little spots between the Bartlett Center and Morrill Hall is a nice little location.
That's a good one.
one of my favorite little spots was by Theta Pond. There used to be a fairly large tree had blown over, and someone had carved a boy with a fishing pole, like he was fishing at Theta Pond. That was destroyed several years ago. Someone just, I guess, didn't appreciate it like I did. But that was, I like those little details and locations. There's especially in the older part of campus, there's spots where classes have left memorials. One of the earlier ones is a rock, a big rock by Old Central. It just says 1905. It was a class memorial. There's another memorial on the sidewalk just east of Gunderson Hall, which was a memorial to I think to servicemen in World War I, or it could have been a class, I'm not sure. There is a memorial to servicemen in World War I in the Bennett Chapel when you first walk in to the right. So there's all kinds of little locations like that, and if you just have a time to dawdle a little bit, you probably see them. Yeah, I've got many spots on campus that I enjoy.
Yeah, and we've got some pictures today to go through campus. Before we start, let me get to a good starting point.
Okay.
Some pictures that we sent for the show. If you want to walk the audience through kind of what we're looking at, and maybe explain a little bit about what it looks like now. Okay.
So this was the first house designed for the president, but the one that the experimentation director lived in. And so it's just north of the Saratine Center. So between where the Saratine Center is and Morrill Avenue, it was a little house tucked in right there. Just north of that were orchards, and we had a vineyard for a while. And I don't know if you can see in the picture, but to the south of that, there was outdoor tennis courts. We had tennis courts briefly. That'd be roughly where that parking lot is between the fire station and the Saratine Center. So we had some outdoor tennis courts.
I love watching them play tennis, and then it looks like the ladies over here in the corner are sitting in what I assume to be the very warm sun. Always is here.
This was the second library, completed in the early 1920s, and so that was the first building exclusively for a library. And so most of our materials were moved in there at that time in the 20s, but by the 30s already, little pocket libraries were forming all over campus, so each school or department seemed to be developing their own library, but it was an attempt to bring all library materials into one location, and that's roughly where the ConocoPhillips Alumni Center is now. That was I call it the Castle on the Prairie. This building was where that tennis court had been, and also between the fire station and Saratine Center. It was built in several sections, but it was just a marvelous facility. It was one of the examples of trouble with the contracting and expanding clay soils. The foundation just couldn't handle it. But it was a beautiful facility, and it was torn down about 1969, 1970 to make way for the expansion of the Saratine Center. And so that parking lot, and there was a building behind it, a little auditorium. It's kind of where the smaller auditorium now is at the Saratine Center. That's that second library again. Now we're looking west, and so that's the east main entrance of that building. You notice it has the columns, so this is a pre-Bennett building. But yeah, that was a nice little facility. This is Lewis Field, and so it's already gone east and west. In the back, you can see, if I can get the cursor, so the back, that's the gymnasium where we are now, architecture. And there were just very minimal stands on both the north and south side. And then there was a track that ran around the field on the interior. And this picture is probably from the early 20s. So it's just recently moved to this location.
And graduation is coming up in a couple weeks. Was this field ever used for graduation?
No, earlier on they didn't have that many students, and so the graduations took place in this building, the gymnasium, and then later when Gallagher Hall, a 4-H building, was completed, then they would hold graduations in there if they needed to. It's not until really the 60s, maybe the late 50s, 60s, 70s, where you have these large graduating classes and huge population coming to see that things move to the stadium, and by then it's changed dramatically.
Stands are filling up.
That's Lowry Lehman Lewis. He was involved with the school. Now it's the School of Arts and Sciences. He was a veterinarian by trade, had a doctorate in veterinary medicine. but was just a leader on campus for a number of years. Served as a president for a short period of time. He was an acting interim president. He was the one who helped design the original Lewis Field. It was a kind of a class project working with some people. But he was just a remarkable gentleman. And I hope there's a facility someplace on campus still named for him. This is Lewis Field in the probably late 50s, maybe early 60s. And so it was open. There was just standstill in the north and south. Of course, that was Gallagher Hall behind it. And now, of course, Gallagher Iba has been built over that. But yeah, this was an earlier version of Lewis Field. Here's one of the earliest images we have of the field that went north and south. And so roughly where those trees are is where we are now at the architecture building. And so the field going north and south, when they put that building there just wasn't room for it. But there was covered stands on the west side, and then there was a little gazebo for the band to sit in. And so we had covered stands and stadium. And then this was the field. And if it got later on in the afternoon, cars sometimes would line the field and just shoot their headlights in. But no games were played in those situations. But if they were practicing late or just have some other activity there. And then this main field here is that parking lot between Thatcher Hall and Spear School of Business, and then Morrill Hall would be the building on the south of that.
And I'm going to pivot really quick because we've got a question from the audience. We're going to jump a couple of decades. Dina wants to ask us, I remember the French Lounge in the Student Union and always wondered about the story behind that room. Any info?
So when the union was first completed, there were a number of lounges, and they would have themes. And so the French Lounge had a French theme to it, and so it was just a nice, well-decorated, well-furnished location for students to relax, kind of like a living room space. And so there were several of these themed lounges that were mostly on the second and third floors of the union initially, and they were just lovely little spots. And like I said, they were furnished with really wonderful furnishings and paintings, and it was like someone's very nice formal living room. So
very nice. Well, speaking of the student union, how did the union come to be? What was its intended purpose?
So after World War II, the GI Bill, we have a large influx of students, and the demographics, our student population grows dramatically at that point. There are a number of students living on campus now. You've got Willard Hall, Stout Hall, what's now the Social Sciences and Humanities building. Cordell Hall is built in the 40s. So you have all of these students living on campus. Each of these residence halls had smaller little lounges in them, but they were looking for a place where more larger groups could gather and student organizations could find a home. And so that was the original intent, was a place where student groups who either had facilities or didn't, but could have their organizational materials and have events at locations in different spaces. And also it served as offices for some of the student assistant groups. But it really was a desire to keep people on campus. At that time, most students don't have cars. There's very few parking lots, and there's not many cars for students. And so they could walk to the union. And there were dances and musical performances and dinners, and just a whole host of activities took place in the student union. And also it was, like I said, the first building that was air conditioned, and so it was a very popular place, especially if you're in a residence hall that's not air conditioned. You could go to the union and cool off in one of the lounges, or go to a dinner or a dance. There was a bowling alley, there was a games room. There was just a host of activities that took place in the union, and it just served kind of the social needs for the student population. So it's a wonderful place, it still is.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot tonight about those changing student populations that eventually had campus changing. And so as the years have kind of gone by and buildings have had to adapt to that, are there any hidden rooms and buildings that the average student wouldn't know were there that we can impart some wisdom on the audience tonight if they keep their eyes peeled.
So I mentioned a few kind of early on, hidden spaces where they really aren't publicly available. I'd encourage people to explore because there are more and more places that are student friendly now. Most of the colleges now have student study spaces, student relaxation places, cafeterias, little cafes and things all throughout campus. And so you just have to go in there and open the door and see what's behind it because I'm really surprised. I discover places all the time that I didn't know exist. And so I just encourage people to see what's out there or ask. There's wonderful places to be discovered.
For certain. And before we head out tonight, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to answer. What's your favorite corner of campus, if you can choose just one or even a few?
If I had to pick one, it would be probably the south steps of Old Central. Especially on a cloudy day, because you have the sun looking, or if it's a cold day and the sun feels warm, feels good. But I like just sitting on those steps or around that little area and just kind of imagining what the campus was like and how it's changed over time. For me, that's a little pleasure to just enjoy the quiet of that space. There's not much really activity around the building. I mean, there's people coming and going some, but it's just a nice, quiet spot that has not changed in over 120 some years. And so I really enjoy kind of feeling a part of something that's been going on for a long period of time. That's my spot.
Thank you for sharing, David. We mentioned that we're in the architecture building tonight, and it is hustling and bustling with students getting ready for finals. So with that, we're going to end the show tonight. Thank you, David, for joining me on Archives Live and sharing with us what you know about our changing facilities on campus. I'm glad that we could answer some questions and hopefully gain some knowledge about hidden spaces on campus you wouldn't think to look for. And of course, thank you to you, our audience, for joining us and commenting and asking questions. Don't forget to check out all of the Archives videos on O State TV and YouTube. The website will be listed at the end of this program. Thanks again, everyone, for watching, and we'll see you next time on Archives Live.